presentation is for Chapter 7, Part 2, and today is the 17th of March, 2022. And let me share my screen with you. Okay. So, hoy vamos a cubrir lo que es la conversación que está pasando entre muchos grupos distintos y lo que es la convención constitucional. Un poquito. So today we're going to cover this conversation and debate that was going on between people about the possible ways of governing the country. And then we'll talk a little bit about the Constitutional Convention. So I start this off with the motto of the United States, which is "E pluribus unum," which means "from many one." And this is the epoch, the time period of the revolution up until the creation of the current Constitution that we have now, which I should have put here, the Constitution of 1787, which is the one we still use. All right. So, empiezo esta presentación con lo que es el lema de los Estados Unidos, "E pluribus unum", lo cual significa "de muchos uno". So, y esto cubre la época de la Revolución y la creación de la Constitución de 1787, que es la Constitución vigente que tenemos ahora. En esa época hay muchos grupos con distintos intereses, igual que siempre en este país, ¿verdad? Cada estado tiene su propio interés que depende de el tipo de negocio o profesión que hacen los ciudadanos. Por ejemplo, en los estados del norte hay comerciantes, ¿verdad? Luego van a empezar fábricas. So, en el norte tienen un tipo de economía. A cambio, en el sur son dueños de plantaciones y esclavos. Tienen una economía, un sistema económico completamente diferente. So, entre los mismos estados hay diferencias de opinión acerca de eso. Luego, también la religión de la mayoría de los ciudadanos del estado. Hay en algunos estados, por ejemplo en el norte, sobre todo cuando llegaron los puritanos, hay muchos protestantes. Realmente los católicos no figuran tanto, más bien son objetos de discriminación en muchos casos. Luego está la Iglesia de Inglaterra, que realmente, se categoriza como una iglesia protestante, pero es diferente que los otros porque realmente sigue mucho la Iglesia Católica. Simplemente cambiaron el que era el jefe de la religión, que es el rey o la reina de Inglaterra. Right? Y el deseo de expandir su territorio es otra diferencia o interés que tienen los estados, right? So during this period of time, there are many groups with many different, distinct interests. And this is just the same way it is now. I mean, there's nothing really different in that. It's always been that way. But what we're looking at here is we have 13 states that are actually like separate countries. So each state has its own interests, right? In how it would like to see things done. So, and that depends partly on, it depends on probably more than 3 things, but I pulled out 3 things that I thought were most important. And that would be the type of business or profession that the citizenry is doing. So what's the economic system in the state, right? And so in the north, we have mostly business people, maybe people who are starting to set up factories, a lot of shipping, export and import, right? And so, and then there's small farmers as well. So that's what's going on in the north. In the south, on the other hand, you have these huge plantations and owners of plantations and people who are also owners of other human beings. In the north, people did own human beings at this time, but that started to gradually go away. And at some point, those states just declared abolition. So the northern states eventually abolished slavery. At this time, they still had it, but it wasn't the same as the South, where you had these huge plantations where a person might have 100 to 200 slaves working their plantation. This is a totally different economic system. So, el sistema de las plantaciones del sur es muy diferente de lo que está pasando en el norte. Aparte de los comerciantes, hay también granjeros pequeños. Pero en el sur no es así. La mayoría son plantaciones enormes y personas que tienen, consideran como su propiedad 100 hasta 200 personas, quizás más. So, es una situación muy diferente en el sur. Right? Okay. Religion is another aspect. So before the 1787 Constitution, each state had its own way of dealing with religion. So in Massachusetts, for example, the Puritans, the Protestant Puritans, established a state religion. So anybody who wasn't part of that religion was subject to discrimination. In the southern colonies, they tended towards the Anglican Church, which is the Church of England. And it was the same kind of thing. They established the religion, and then that meant that those people who weren't part of that religion were subject to discrimination. So this is another thing, and some of these states felt that it was important to have a state religion. And then the other thing over which they argued amongst themselves, the states, was the desire to expand westward, to expand their territory westward. And they were bickering, quarreling over, what belonged to whom. So, el tercer aspecto, o la tercera diferencia que destaqué aquí, es el deseo de expandir su territorio. So, cada estado quería expandir su territorio, por lo menos los que estaban en la orilla oeste querían expandir su territorio, y hubo problemas, discusiones acerca de quién era dueño de cuál terreno. So, eso era un problema también, y algo en el interés del estado, ¿no? De cada estado. Los otros grupos se diferencian, o sea, estuve hablando del propio interés de los estados, pero también hay otros grupos, no solo los estados, sino que grupos que se diferencian por clase social, religión, raza, país de origen, género, tipo de trabajo o profesión o experiencia durante la revolución. Algunos fueron soldados y otros fueron generales, ¿verdad? Y algunos quizás estaban fuera de la zona donde hubo más combate. So, at the end of the revolution and during this period of time, it's not just the states that have their own interests, but you have other groups who are different from each other because of their social class, their religion, their race, the country they come from, right? Because when the Irish people first started coming here, they were discriminated against because they were Catholic. Also because a lot of the people who were here already had been English, and there's an old antagonism between the English and the Irish because the English are always trying to take Ireland over. That's why we're wearing green today, right? Um, also, gender, right? The type of work or the profession that somebody did, or that person's experience during the revolution. Some people were soldiers and other people were generals, and some people might have been really far from the combat zones and not really taken part at all. So, all of these different groups have different wants and desires. And so, how do we make one nation with all these different things? So, todos estos grupos distintos tienen sus propias necesidades, sus propios deseos, sus propios intereses, y cómo hacemos de todas esas muchas distintas personas y grupos, cómo hacemos uno. ¿Verdad? Y ese era lo problemático, porque si estaban debatiendo, una cosa que quería destacar aquí era que sí hubo un ambiente de posibilidad, de oportunidad, y hubo mucha conversación y debate sobre qué tipo de gobierno es mejor, right? So, y sí voy a hablar un poquito más de eso in un momento. So, there's a lot going on at this time, all these different groups, all these people, there's a lot of debate. There's this feeling of possibility because we're a new country and we can make ourselves into whatever we want, right? So there's a lot of debate and conversation going on and writing and going on about what's the best form of government. Is slavery moral? Actually, I got to get back to that in a minute. Okay, so, los artículos de la Confederación, porque antes de 1787 están bajo los artículos de la Confederación. Y los artículos de la Confederación eran más bien como un acuerdo de amistad que una forma de gobernar un país. Cada estado es un país soberano. Eso quiere decir que ellos tienen sus propias leyes, no deben ninguna lealtad a nadie más arriba de ellos, right? So, let me think. El Congreso Continental no tenía manera de recaudar impuestos, haciéndolo difícil pagar las deudas. Ponían impuestos, los estados hasta se pusieron de acuerdo, ok, sí, tenemos que pagar esa guerra, sí, vamos a poner impuestos, pero ¿cómo los hacían recaudarlos? Para que acabaran con el gobierno, con el Congreso Continental. No tenían manera de esforzarlo. Disputaban los territorios del oeste, como dije antes. So, under the Articles of Confederation, the Articles of Confederation are basically like a treaty between 13 completely separate sovereign countries. They don't really owe any loyalty to the national government at all because they're each their own state. So, the Continental Congress said, hey, we got to pay for this war that we had. So we're going to impose this tax, but they had no way of enforcing the states paying the taxes to them. And I'll talk a little bit more about the problem the states were having with the raising the money as well. It's not like the states were necessarily in bad faith, but they were having trouble getting money from their citizens. And then, they were also disputing the territory in the West, as I already said. So, debido a los tantos grupos distintos, hubo mucho debate y conversación acerca de las mejores maneras de gobernar y sobre los derechos, debatiendo ideas sobre varias... Oh, I'm sorry, me perdí el lugar. Y sobre los derechos humanos y cívicos y quienes los meritaban. Eso es importante, right? So, se publicaban panfletos y libros debatiendo ideas sobre varios temas. Tener o no un fuerte gobierno central. La moralidad de esclavizar a otros humanos. Si tener una religión oficial del Estado o no. Los derechos de las mujeres. Aunque no estaban pensando en lo de votar en ese momento, pero por lo menos derechos a su propiedad y derecho a la educación. La moralidad de quitar el terreno a los nativoamericanos, porque sí hablaban de eso. Sí hablaban de eso, aunque lo escondían. Right? So, because of all these different groups, there was a lot of debate and conversation about what's the best way to govern, and about human rights and civic rights, and who should get human rights and civic rights. Even though they said that everybody should get them, they still kind of did that thing. You know what, you guys? I have you all muted, so if anybody has a question, you can do the raise your hand thing. So what did they debate about? So they published pamphlets and books debating a lot of different ideas. Among those ideas, whether or not to have a strong central government. A lot of people were afraid of having a strong central government. That's what they just got done with, right? Other people were like, well, if we don't have some kind of strong central government, we're just going to have chaos. The morality of enslaving other human beings. People were starting to talk about this. Hey, you know, we said all men are created equal. Isn't it kind of hypocritical for us to have some of these people as if they were our property? And other people were saying, you know, they're not as good as us, so it's okay. Debating whether or not to have an official state religion or not. This was a big one. You know, a lot of these people came from countries where there was an official state religion, and that's what you did. But some of them had been persecuted because they didn't want to belong to the official state religion. So that was a debate. Debating women's rights. This wasn't so much about voting at that point, because remember, at this point, really only white men who have property can vote. So they're not really thinking about giving a lot of people the right to vote. But women were saying, wait a minute, you know, under the laws of Great Britain, we didn't have the rights to our property. We didn't really get to get an education. And so they're starting to debate these kind of things as well. And then another one is the morality of taking away the land from the Native Americans. That was a big debate. There were people who said, wait a minute, we can't just go in here. These people are already here. This belongs to them. We can't just go in and take it. Unfortunately, the majority of the European Americans said, yes, we can take it. So these are some of the ideas that people are debating. You know, publishing, writing about it, and debating it in coffee houses. So si pueden imaginar que la gente está publicando panfletos, leyendo libros, hablando en los cafés, hablando en la iglesia, en la misa, lo que sea, la gente está hablando de todas esas ideas. Y y muchas de esas ideas todavía seguimos hablando de ellas. We're still debating this stuff. We're still debating this stuff, right? Okay. Muchas de las ideas de la filosofía de la Ilustración vienen de los nativoamericanos. Los filósofos europeos leían los reportes de los que fueron a las Américas. En particular, hay un libro que se llama Diálogos curiosos con un salvaje de buen juicio, quien ha viajado, por el barón de la Hontan, publicado en el 1703, so unos años antes. Pero este libro, en este libro, el varón escribió acerca de conversaciones que él realmente tuvo con Kondiaronk, que era un representante de su nación, que quizás hasta fue a Europa como representante de su nación. No sabemos, pero quizás fue. Él hacía una crítica de la sociedad europea como él lo vio, y este varón escribió las cosas que dijo Kondiaronk. Voy a intentar añadir eso, el nombre de Kondiaronk al rato aquí para que esté más completo. So, during this time, we're talking about Enlightenment philosophy. So this idea of innate human rights comes from Enlightenment philosophy. But a lot of these ideas actually came from Native American critique of European society. So, and the European philosophers read the stuff that was coming out of the Americas. They read the reports that people sent back from the Americas to the European courts, churches, right? And among those is one called Curious Dialogues with a Savage of Good Sense Who Has Traveled. And this was written by this Baron de la Hontan from France, who actually had conversations with this Native American representative of his tribe, who may have gone to Europe as a representative of his tribe, in other words, as a diplomat. And he made a lot of critique about European society, and he had conversations with this Baron de la Hontan, and told him what he thought of European society. So these things were published, and the Enlightenment philosophers were reading them. And so it's very interesting that today, when we learn about Montesquieu and these ideas of the Enlightenment, we rarely learn where the ideas actually came from in the first place. It's as if they were born in Europe, but actually a lot of the ideas came from the Americas, and the Europeans wove them into their own philosophy and put them out there as the way that people should set up their governments. They should have representation. So, anyway, okay, next. División de los terrenos ajenos. Una de las pocas cosas que pudo lograr el Congreso Continental fue establecer un sistema para la división y venta de los terrenos ajenos, porque realmente no pertenecían a ellos, de los territorios de lo que era entonces el oeste del país. Okay, so este mapa es un poco difícil de ver, después lo explico. Chance debo de poner. No, esta imagen está en el texto. So, this one of the few things, dividing land that doesn't belong to you is what this slide is called. One of the few things that the Continental Congress was able to do was to establish a system for the division and sale of the land of the territories at the west side of the country. So they weren't actually states yet. They were territories, right? So they decided there's a formula they came up with. Once a territory gets to a certain number of inhabitants, then they start to go through this process to eventually become a state. So they outlined a process for how the territories can become states, and also for how to divide the land. So hicieron un sistema de cómo un territorio iba a hacerse estado, y de cómo dividir el terreno. Y aquí dice cómo hicieron. No sé si han ido en avión y si están arriba del país ven que todo está cuadradito. Es porque diseñaron ese sistema de dividirlo en cuadros. Right? So if you've ever flown in an airplane over the country, you will see the legacy of this system that they came up with because they divided everything in a grid, a square-like grid. So when you fly over the country, you see all this land divided up into squares. It's actually pretty obvious out in the country. All right. This image is in the textbook. So you can look in there, you'll see it better. It's kind of hard to see here, but I just wanted to show it. Okay. So este sí, por lo menos, hizo que los estados no estuvieran discutiendo tanto entre ellos acerca de los territorios y la expansión. So this meant that at least, because this was actually successful, the states agreed to this, and so they quit fighting with each other over this western expansion until the issue of slavery came up, and that's aparte. All right. Okay. Los problemas en Massachusetts estallaron en rebelión y vamos a ver una película acerca de eso, así que nada más lo voy a tratar un poco ligeramente aquí. El dinero de papel del Estado no valía mucho y era difícil usarlo para pagar los impuestos. So, los estados se pusieron de acuerdo que iban a dar ese dinero al gobierno, al Congreso Continental para que pagara la deuda del país. Pero cada estado tenía su propio dinero de papel y no valía casi nada. Y la gente que no era terrateniente, o sea, la gente trabajadora, no tenían oro y plata, tenían dinero de papel. Seguro que cuando pagaron a los soldados por haber combatido en la revolución, les dio dinero de papel. Y entonces hubo mucha inflación. Y cuando los veteranos de la guerra tenían ese dinero, no podían pagar los impuestos con ese dinero. No podían pagar préstamos con ese dinero. Y estaban en peligro de perder sus fincas, sus granjas pequeñas. All right? So, problems in Massachusetts exploded into rebellion. We're going to watch a movie about this, so I'm just going to keep it short. But basically, each state's paper money wasn't worth really anything. People really needed gold and silver to pay, but most people did not have gold and silver. Only people of a higher social class would have that. So working people have this paper money, and when we're talking working people, particularly in the north, in Massachusetts, there's a lot of small farmers. There's a tax on their land that they need to pay, or maybe they have a mortgage on their land, right? A loan. And they can't pay with this paper money, and they don't have access to gold and silver, and so some of them are losing their farms. Another thing the book mentions is that a lot of the soldiers, because they were, in their teens and their 20s when they were fighting, they missed out on the opportunity to learn a trade. Otra cosa que dice el texto es que muchos de los soldados, como eran adolescentes o jóvenes en sus 20, que perdieron la oportunidad de aprender ¿cómo se dice? No solamente una profesión, pero un trabajo, ¿verdad? Porque estaban combatiendo, no estaban aprendiendo cómo hacer agricultura o cómo construir un barco o lo que sea, right? So, and there was a lot of inflation, and the veterans of the war got this paper money for their pay, and then they couldn't use it to pay their taxes on their farms, or to pay if they had a loan, they couldn't use it. And so they were in danger of losing their farms. So people were in dire straits. They were in dire straits. La gente estaba en una situación muy dura durante ese tiempo. So, y después veremos la película que nos dirá más. So we'll watch the little movie after this, and it'll give us a lot more detail about this. It's interesting. Okay. Y lo último, the last thing, the Constitution of 1787. So, de todo eso dijeron, como que no está funcionando esta cosa. Intentaron hacer una convención continental antes, pero no todos fueron, pero en 1787 hicieron una invitación para que fueran a Filadelfia en mayo para hacer otra convención, y realmente era para hacer unos cambios a los artículos de la Confederación para que pudieran recaudar impuestos para pagar la deuda, para ver cómo mejoraban el comercio entre los estados y varias cosas, pero a fin de cuentas dijeron, no tiene sentido intentar corregir esto, está mal, vamos a empezar desde nuevo. So they had tried to have a continental convention. They had a first Continental Convention. I don't remember the year, but it'll say in the textbook. And it was before 1787, obviously. And not all the states went, so they really couldn't do anything. Evidently, they started to take this seriously in 1787, and so there was an invitation for a second Continental Convention to happen in May of 1787 in Philadelphia. And the original idea of the convention was to make changes to the Articles of Confederation, changes so that they could raise taxes, not raise them and just make them higher, but be able to collect them, which was the problem. Not being able to collect them was a big issue. And so, that, and, how would they improve business between the separate states, because that was an issue. That's one of the reasons there was so much inflation, because it was hard to get things from one place to another. So they wanted to tackle these problems, but in the end they said, there's no way we can fix this. We just need to start all over again. And remember, they've been having these conversations all along about how should the government work, how should the government work. So it's not like they suddenly just said, oh, let's start again, and they had to start with something brand new. They had all the ideas, they just needed to put them together. So decidieron hacer algo nuevo. Hay que acordarnos que tenían las ideas, venían debatiendo las ideas. So no era como si empezaran sin ninguna idea. Ya tenían ideas de cómo querían ese gobierno. Los estados tenían sus constituciones ya. Cada estado tenía su constitución. So ya han escrito constituciones, ya van a escribir uno nuevo para todo el país. Y están buscando la contribución de cada estado, right? So the other thing, it's not like they haven't been doing this business of writing constitutions. They've already written state constitutions. Each state has its own constitution. So during this time, the states have been writing their own constitutions, and they each have their own way of doing things. And so each state brings to this convention some knowledge already about what it is each state wants in their government. All right. So, cuando ya decidieron escribir una constitución nueva, hubo 3 asuntos problemáticos que tenían que resolver a base de concesiones para poder ponerse de acuerdo con la constitución. So, in this convention, as they're talking about things, there were 3 problematic issues that had to be resolved by compromise. So everything else they were able to resolve and get unanimous agreement on it, but there were these three issues that they were having a really hard time coming to agreement on, and so they had to make compromise in order to come to agreement. So those three are, I'll do it in Spanish first. So esos tres asuntos fueron, los voy a tomar uno por uno, español, inglés. La cuestión de la representación. ¿Cómo resolver el problema de que hay unos estados que tienen mucha más gente? Tienen una población muy grande y otros estados que tienen una población mucho más pequeña. So, si la representación es a base de población, los estados pequeños van a tener menos voz en el gobierno y no van a tener ninguna consideración de sus intereses, al menos que sus intereses sean diferentes que los de los estados más poblados. Ese es un problema. Ese se resolvió con el Congreso bicameral. So, tenemos el Senado, que viene siendo 2 representantes de cada estado. So, en el Senado, cada estado tiene la misma representación, no importa cuántas personas hayan. Eso beneficia a los estados pequeños, obviamente. En la Cámara de Representantes, es por población. So, por ejemplo, California, obviamente California no existía en aquellos tiempos. Imagino que fue Nueva York, muy poblado. Pero California tiene muchos más representantes que Wyoming. ¿Por qué? Porque tenemos muchas más personas, una población mucho más alta. Eso hace que los estados que tienen más gente sí tiene una voz más fuerte, porque representan más gente, ¿verdad? Okay, so the first problematic issue is the problem of representation. We have a problem because we have some states that have a lot more people than others. And if you strictly go off of, okay, the more people a state has, the more representatives they get, then the small states completely lose their voice. Nobody's going to pay attention to their needs and interests because they don't have enough people to speak up against these states that do have so many people. On the other hand, the smaller states were like, no, every state should have the same number of representatives. But if you do that, then the small states are able to dictate laws for many, many people who don't even live in their state. So that wasn't satisfactory either. So the compromise they came up with is the Congress we currently have, which is a 2-house Congress. And the Senate, each state gets the same number of representatives. Every state has 2 senators. Doesn't matter how many people they have 2 senators. In the House of Representatives, the state gets a certain number of representatives per population. So the more population they have, the more representatives they have. California, for example, has many more representatives than Wyoming because the population is much bigger here. So this way they balance the needs of both large states and small states. Así balancearon las necesidades y los intereses de ambos. Okay. La cuestión de la esclavitud. Contar o no la gente esclavizada para determinar la población de un estado para decidir. So, no están cuestionando realmente la esclavitud en sí. Están cuestionando si van a contar la gente esclavizada como parte de la población de un estado para decidir el número de representantes que van a tener en la Cámara de Representantes. Okay. Los estados del sur que tenían una población muy, muy alta de gente esclavizada, claro que, que querían que se contaran cada uno de ellos para calcular la población del estado. Pero los estados del norte dijeron, pues eso no está bien porque ustedes están poniendo los esclavos en sus impuestos. Si pierden, si un esclavo muere, ustedes lo ponen como una pérdida, ¿verdad? O sea, ustedes están tratando a los esclavos como propiedad, no como personas. ¿Cómo quieren contarlos como si fueran parte de la población cuando ni los tratan como humanos, right? So one of the other issues is the issue of slavery, not the issue of whether or not there will be slavery, but the issue of whether or not slaves are going to be counted for the purpose of determining the population of a state in order to determine how many representatives they get to have. So the South is like, yeah, hey, these are part of our people. And the North is like, you're treating them like property. You and not just treating. In other words, not just the treatment they gave, but in fact listing them as property, leaving them to their heirs. That's property. Those aren't people, that's property. And so the North is saying you're trying to, have these people be property and at the same time have them be people. You got to make up your mind, one or the other. Right? So they had to come up with a compromise, and the compromise they came up with was they decided that they would count every 3 out of 5 slaves as a person, and the other 2 were not counted. Okay, so la concesión que hicieron, el compromiso a que llegaron, fue contar cada 3 de 5 esclavos como parte de la población y los otros 2 no contaban. So, en una familia de 5, 3 contaron como parte de la población y los otros 2 no. El último asunto fue la cuestión de la democracia. Acuérdense que estos eran la mayoría gente élite, gente con dinero, gente con educación, gente con poder. Y muchos de ellos tenían ideas clasistas y racistas y sexistas, aunque pues en ese momento ni estaban pensando en eso, right? So, no querían que la gente eligiera directamente al presidente. Pensaban, si dejamos a toda la gente elegir directamente al presidente, van a votar mal. Van a votar en contra de nuestros intereses. Así que diseñaron el colegio electoral que todavía tenemos hoy en día, que ha sido un asunto de mucha controversia ya por varios años. Porque con la elección de Trump, solo ganó porque ganó el colegio electoral. El voto popular no fue por él, fue por Clinton. Pero ganó él por culpa de este colegio electoral que pusieron los élites cuando hicieron la Constitución en 1787. All right. So the last issue of contention, of problems, was the question of democracy. And most of the people at this convention were wealthy people and powerful people and people who had education, and they had their own interests at heart. They wanted to protect their property and they want to protect their way of doing things. So they did not want the people to directly elect the president. because they felt that the people would elect a president that would not be in their own interests, the elite's interest. So they devised the Electoral College, which we still have now, and which people are saying, this is not democratic. This is how we had in 2016 a president who did not win the popular vote, but became president because he got the vote in the Electoral College. So, ese es el final de la presentación para hoy. This is the end of my presentation for today.